Welcome to another in a series of history talks at the online Congregational Library. Today's a very important talk because we're going to focus on one of the library's most innovative and important projects, New England's Hidden Histories. And here to talk to us are going to be three individuals who are very involved with this. First is Jeff Cooper. Jeff taught early American history at Oklahoma State University, where he was named Regents Distinguished Research Professor. He has authored Tenacious of Their Liberties, The Congregationalist in Colonial Massachusetts, and for the past 12 years, he has been the director of New England's Hidden Histories. Also with us is going to be Richard Boles, the author of the recently released book, Dividing the Faith, The Rise of Segregated Churches in Early New England in the Early American North. He's an assistant professor of early American history at Oklahoma State University, where he teaches about Native American, African American, and American religious histories. And I might say that in a forthcoming history talk, Richard is going to be interviewed about his new book by Yale's Dr. Ken Minkema. And finally, we also have Dr. Douglas Winiarski. Doug is a professor of religious studies and American studies at the University of Richmond, and he is the author of the prize-winning book, multiple prize-winning book, Darkness Falls on the Light of the Land, Experiencing Religious Awakenings in 18th Century New England. And we asked both Richard and Doug to be here because both of them have used New England's Hidden Histories in doing their research and writing their recent books. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Cooper to conduct the program. Jeff?
Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for being here. I am presuming that for many viewers, this presentation is going to serve as something of an introduction to our project. So I want to start for a few minutes by providing a little bit of a history and overview of New England's Hidden Histories. New England's Hidden Histories is a program led by the Congregational Library in Boston, aimed at preserving New England's colonial era manuscript church records and making them available to the public. So we have something of a two-pronged approach. First, we're trying to preserve these documents both physically when we can, and especially digitally through digital preservation. Beyond the preservation mission, and certainly of equal importance, we're trying to make these documents available to the public by publishing our digital images online and by transcribing as many church records as we can. So a little backstory about the origins of the project. All the way back in 1980, my graduate advisor, Harry Stout, now of Yale University, recommended that I write a master's thesis on the office of ruling elder within early congregational churches. And so I asked, where am I going to find anything about ruling elders? And he said, well, you'll find information about them in church records. And I said, where am I going to find church records? And he handed me this massive tome. It was in much better shape in 1980. This is the Harold F. Worthley inventory of early Massachusetts church records. Dr. Worthley was the longtime executive director of the Congregational Library in Boston. His inventory was a 10-year labor of love, and with his inventory, I had access to what church records were out there and where to find them. And so I was on my way. The excitement of my early research ended up centering not so much on the importance of the office of ruling elder. The excitement stemmed from what I discovered about the manuscript church records themselves. As most of us know, a staggering number of books and articles have been written about the early New England Congregationalists, most of them by Dr. Bremer. what I discovered was that very little of the existing literature was based on the manuscripts that were described in the Worthley inventory. So I took it upon myself to write a dissertation and later a book on one of countless topics upon which these records cast light. I've written about the evolution of congregational church government and lay clerical relations in early New England. And again, so much had been written about these specific themes, but with little reference to the church records that were obviously very central to the topic. Beyond my discovery that these records had been underutilized, I discovered why these manuscripts were underutilized. As the Worthley inventory reveals, New England church records in general are scattered all over New England. Connecticut's done a pretty good job in centralizing its early church records at the Connecticut State Library in Hartford. And major repositories like the New Hampshire Historical Society and Maine and Massachusetts Historical Societies, they certainly hold important collections, but to a surprising degree, I found that New England's church records are held mainly in local libraries and local repositories, and especially still within local churches. The more I utilize these records for my own research, the more I came to believe that we can learn more about New England life from them than from any other discrete body of sources. The reason that so few people had utilized them was that to a great degree, they were simply inaccessible. Long before the pandemic, and I think Doug can testify to this as well, it took a lot of time to get through to any given local church to make an appointment. You have to reach the right person. You have to travel to the church, and if you're lucky, the church might have an archive as big as this room, full of documents. What I'm driving at here is that a great many churches had far more than you could digest in a single sitting or two. The other, I guess, rather startling discovery was that many of these documents I found were in danger. I've seen priceless manuscripts stored in what I would charitably describe as less than ideal archival conditions, in church basements, in attics, under a secretary's desk, in file cabinets. Found an amazing collection on the floor of the pastor's coat closet. Closets that contain the photocopy supplies. In one case, the invaluable church records were in boxes that were covered up by the church's artificial Christmas trees. Consequently, and this probably isn't that surprising, I've seen priceless manuscripts that have been burned, faded, covered in mold, water damaged, dried out to the point that they were crumbling. Over the centuries, a great many documents have been destroyed by fire. Some have been stolen. But most of all, the church records tend to get lost. I had quite a career in traveling to churches with the Worthley inventory and pointing out that as of circa 1970, these 5 ledgers were stored at your church, and may I please see them? And often the church elders would look at one another and report to me, sadly, there's no one at the church who has any idea where these records are located. So I shared my observations over the years with Professor Stout and my scholarly partner, Ken Minkema, who is the director of the Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale. And we came to understand that some kind of initiative needed to be taken to rescue these documents and to make them accessible to the public. In 2005, Ken approached Dr. Peggy Bendroth, the new executive director at the Congregational Library, and suggested that the Congregational Library would be a natural home for this kind of initiative. And Peggy was very receptive to the idea. And so what would later become New England's Hidden Histories finally had itself an institutional home. To an extent, our project grew hand in hand with the online and digital revolution. We quickly decided that to the extent that we could, we would digitize these documents and publish them online so that anyone with access to a computer could access them. The problem is that large-scale digitization projects are usually the province of large universities and much larger institutions. The Congregational Library is a distinguished institution that dates all the way back into the 19th century, but still, compared to others, it's relatively modest in size. So that we knew that we were going to need to secure outside funding if the project was going to grow into something other than sort of a side endeavor. Years down the line, and after a number of false starts, we put together a proposal that we submitted to the National Endowment for the Humanities with the help of Lynn Rhodes, who was the former editor of the New England Quarterly. And we received a really big break in 2014 when the New York Times decided to run a front page story about our project. And I was just as shocked as everyone else. And this front page story came out at the same time that our grant proposal went out. So a little bit of serendipity there. Our NEHH proposal was approved, and it provided funds to cover about half of the expenses associated with the project for a 3-year period. But it was enough of a vote of confidence to turn Hidden Histories into a full-time initiative. Subsequently, we have received funding from the Council on Library and Informational Resources, which is funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and we've received a second NEHH grant. So I want to be sure to give a major shout out to these two organizations, because our project simply never would have taken off in the way that it did if not for their support. Continued support for Hidden Histories from both outside agencies and from the Congregational Library itself has allowed us to expand our focus. Specifically, we have established partnerships with other repositories, large and small, from throughout New England. I cannot name all of our partners because the list is very, very long, but some examples include the American Antiquarian Society, the Historical Societies of Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, the New England Historic and Genealogical Society, and the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. These partnerships allowed us to expand our reach into the other New England states, and they allowed us to expand the kinds of documents that we make available. And our partners have been enormously helpful in assisting us to publicize our efforts and get the word out about what we're doing. What kind of records do we make available? What do we mean when we say that we're putting church records online? Well, initially we confined ourselves to church records pretty much as defined by Hal Worthley. The running records of church meetings, specifically internal religious affairs that were covered essentially in Sunday church meetings. Most manuscript record books that worthily defined as church records were specific books that contained lists of those that were baptized into the church, those who were admitted to full communion. Very often they contain lists of marriages and deaths. But beyond these invaluable vital statistics, and heaven knows they're terribly important for genealogists, they contain minutes of church meetings, which usually include accounts of disciplinary affairs and other decisions that churches were required to make. And often we have fulsome accounts of the sometimes rowdy debates that accompanied these debates. Often these accounts extend on for pages at a time. They often include dialogue. They sometimes include verbatim quotations. At their very best, church records allow you to open up the window to the church, pull the curtains aside, stick your head in there, and witness what was going on inside the church. But sometimes church records can also be elliptical. Sometimes they can be frustratingly indirect, more like you're peering through a window, but the window is cloudy, or you're eavesdropping on a conversation and the conversation is muffled. So you catch some of what's going on, but you're not entirely sure of the topic of the conversation or the conclusions. So we try to address this challenge by expanding the kinds of records that we make available. We have expanded our definition of what we mean by church records. We found that conventional church records, as defined by Worthley, can be that much more illuminated or illuminating if they are supplemented by sermons. There are churches whose early records don't exist, and the only accounts we have of life inside the church would be sermons that survive. Lay relations of faith, which were brief spiritual autobiographies that prospective members delivered as a condition for church membership, they cast much light on early New England life and culture. Prayer bids, records of ministerial associations and consociations, church correspondence, diaries, financial records. All of these kinds of documents are important to the creation of a mosaic through which we can learn so much about early church life. Taken together, these records provide us an unrivaled view of early New England life and culture. We have records of one sort or another online from over 100 different early New England churches, and our collections are growing every month. I just want to provide a few examples. We have online the church record book from Rowley, which probably is one of the most valuable documents to survive from early America in general, not just New England. It's kind of a freakish account because for whatever reason, instead of summarizing church meetings and meetings he had with parishioners and so forth, the minister tended to write everything down. So this one volume, which essentially covers from 1667 to about 1690, the vital statistics go longer than that, but the volume is over 500 densely packed pages, and we've got that volume transcribed, and the transcription is soon to go online. From Natick, we have the only church record book to survive from a church that was simultaneously both English congregational and Native American. From Middleborough, we discovered nearly 500 relations of faith and confessions for various misbehaviors, supplemented by a large collection of sermons that were preached in the colonial era, and a full run of traditional church records. We have online the records of the Abyssinian Church from Portland, Maine. To our knowledge, these are the only records online, at least in New England, from a church that was a Black church. Westboro, we are partnered with the Reverend Ebenezer Parkman Project out of the Westboro Public Library. And between the Parkman Project and New England's Hidden Histories, researchers have access to an amazing volume of church records, a collection of relations of faith, association records, sermons, loose papers, and an astounding 4,000-page diary kept by Ebenezer Parkman. Parkman was sort of like the Rowley minister. He tended to write everything down. Lay relations of faith, I've mentioned a couple of times. We have at this point, I'm guessing over 1,000 of them, certainly the largest collection in America. The collections have been digitized. A great many of them have been transcribed. From the Salem area, we have Cambridge sermons and sermons preached at Newberry, both during the witchcraft controversy, very exciting for historians. And we have the Danvers, the Salem Village church records online as well. It is very easy to access our material. All you have to do is a simple Google search for New England's Hidden Histories, or do a Google search for Congregational Library Boston. And that will take you to our webpage. Everything is clearly mapped out. It's very easy to navigate it. I can do it, and if I can do it, anyone in the audience can do it. So with that, I would now like to turn to our distinguished guests. Before we get to the specifics of your own work, Doug and Rich, I want to ask you both, please, to reflect on how and why you think New England's hidden history is important, both for the scholarly world and the general public. This is obviously a very broad question, but Richard, please have a go.
Thank you. There's so much I could say about this, and even your description just now, gets me excited for parts of the collection that I haven't had a chance to look at yet, and for the things that you're going to be releasing soon. I can't wait to explore the new collections. It seems like every time I go on the website, there's something new to look through, and if only I had more time to spend on the website. Yeah, as much as I love being in the reading room at the Congregational Library, it was the first library I ever did research in. New England Hidden Histories has closed the distance for me from Oklahoma, where I spend most of the time, and Boston. I can go on the computer and essentially go back and be in that reading room in Boston, because all of the material that I had used in person years ago, I can now access on the computer. And more than that, my students can access it. And so the ability to use these collections in teaching undergraduates and graduates, and getting students, even grad students, into colonial era records can be a little intimidating with the when they first open a page of documents and see the handwriting, sometimes the very bad handwriting. And so the transcriptions is even more important, especially in these first forays that a student takes into some of these colonial records to do research projects on topics all the way across the country. I think another important thing for me is that there was no way I would have been able to find some of these church records. There's no way I would have been able to look at these stories without this project, particularly finding information about African Americans in the 18th century or 17th century New England, for that matter, is really difficult, painstaking work. And the Congregational Library found records of African Americans who basically scholars had never known about before. And in a lot of cases, enslaved men and women in a lot of New England towns, we don't even know their names. Just the fact that we have names for some of these enslaved people is a breakthrough for scholars, because we sometimes see a number of enslaved people on a census or a number of enslaved people on a will or an estate inventory. But the church records provide at least usually names, but oftentimes even more detail about these people and their religious choices, their religious involvement in town, their relationship to other family members, to other enslaved people, and sadly, in many cases, their relationship to churches and to enslavers. And one example that comes to mind is a church that actually raised money to purchase an enslaved man for the church, for the minister's use. And eventually that church decided to sell that enslaved man. And the records say that this enslaved man, Andrew, was, quote, sold at the best advantage. That the church is seeking to make essentially a profit on selling, or at least maybe breaking even, selling an enslaved man. And so to see that relationship in the church records, I wouldn't have ever gotten to that congregation's records if they had remained in the local library or in the church attic. But that story gets told in my book because it was found by New England Histories and because it was digitized.
Thanks, Richard. I just wanted to relate a little anecdote. A student came to me at Oklahoma State and wanted to work with the church records. I handed her some photocopy and she left graduate school. Never really explained to me what had happened, but she was so intimidated by the handwriting, she thought that she could not do it. And it points to a couple of things. It takes a little bit of patience to learn to read the manuscripts, but also the importance of the fact that we're transcribing these documents. A newspaper reporter wrote an article about our project and wanted to use some quotations, and he said, you're going to have to provide some. And I said, well, there's 10,000 pages online. And he said, yes, and I'd be happy to direct my readers there, but there's nothing there for them to read. I said, what are you talking about? He said, nobody's going to be able to read any of those documents. I can't even pull any quotes out. If you want some quotes in the story, then you're going to have to provide them, because I can't make anything out of these records. Okay, Doug, tell us a bit about your sense of how important the project is for scholars and the general public.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's really great to be with you all this morning. And New England Hidden Histories is something really close to my heart. I was fortunate enough to be invited to be on the steering committee when the project first began. And so it's great to see how it's grown over the years. And as Richard's saying, congregational church records really yield their secrets slowly, and it requires a lot of diligence and care, as his recent book has shown, to extract and find those compelling stories. But one of the things that Hidden Histories does, and I think does well, I think we can think about it as a working laboratory for studying early American history. For the first time, because, as Jeff, you were saying before, the sort of mosaic effect of bringing collections together in a digital space, it allows us to see patterns, to test ideas, to test new ways of studying early American religious history, all from one site and from any location. And I think that's a really, really important opportunity for not just for genealogists and not only for students, but especially for scholars. The next generation of scholarship in American religious history is going to deal with issues of traditional topics like beliefs and theology and family life and communities, but increasingly new kinds of projects like Richard's project on African and Native American congregationalists. There are so many ways that the Congregational Libraries, New England Hidden Histories projects can assist the next generation of scholarship. I'm just thinking right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And one of the things that readers will find regularly in almost any church record book from Northern New England, from places north of Boston and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, will be evidence of the devastating throat distemper epidemic of the 1730s, which claimed thousands of lives of children under the age of 15 and triggered significant outbreaks of surges in church admission in congregations all throughout Northern New England. So scholars interested in epidemiology, the history of epidemics, the history of disease, will find a ready database of sources to look at in the Hidden Histories project. In my own work, much like Richard, I spent a lot of time digging around in archives, visiting churches, going to historical societies. It's the ability to find everything in one place that I think makes New England's Hidden History such an extraordinary opportunity for scholars in the 21st century.
Thanks, Doug. I want to follow up with another question. As you mentioned, you are on our, you have been on our advisory board for many years. Our mission statement states in the first of its core commitments that the Congregational Library is the steward specifically of colonial-era New England church records. And this is has been a topic for discussion, as you know, at the meetings of the advisory board. And we do extend into the 19th century for certain cases, certain circumstances. The Abyssinian church records, for example, don't commence, I think, until the early 1840s. If we can find information on abolitionism, we will digitize it. I found a set of records that lays bare divisions between Federalists and Jeffersonians in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. But for the most part, clearly, we focus on records from the American Revolution and back. And I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on why it's so important that we focus specifically on New England colonial church records.
Well, in those conversations that we had, I'm a firm proponent of the Hidden Histories Project gathering records that are of historical value, even into the 19th century. But that said, you know, the 18th century is really the great heyday of New England Congregational churches. I mean, it's the time in which New England's congregational establishment was at its strongest. And the records are in some ways most robust and most at risk. So the ones you were talking about, I think, are the records we talked about earlier in this conversation, the ones you find in church attics and in basements and in vaults that are kind of crumbling and suffering from water damage, are records that are in greatest need of preservation. I think there's also a need for the project to focus on those early records because of institutional memory issues. Just to take the Middleborough relations as an example, when Jack Bumstead was doing his dissertation research in the 1960s, he was writing an ecclesiastical history of southeastern Massachusetts. He went to Middleborough and he saw those relations, but the church clerk refused to let him read, like, do anything other than read them, couldn't quote for them. And when you read his dissertation, you realize like they were really jealous of guarding those things because they thought there was sensitive information in them. That was during the 1960s. Fast forward to when I first looked at those records down in Middleborough in the 1990s, and times had changed. Families had moved out. Some of the longstanding New England families had moved out, and new families had moved in, and the institutional memory of the Middleborough Congregational Church was different. And what struck me is sort of very typical kinds of church discipline issues that wouldn't have been particularly controversial in the 18th century. Issues about having children 5 months after marriage, or someone maybe perhaps being seen on the streets and having drank a little bit too much. Those kinds of very basic congregational church records discipline issues that were seen as so scandalous in the 1960s were no longer an issue in the 1990s for the community. And as a result, then those records were slowly being forgotten. If they were no longer the records of our ancestors, if they're the records of people we no longer know anymore, then the danger exists that communities will not necessarily feel compelled to take care of those records. And I think in this moment, in the 21st century, the Congregational Library has a really important role to play in making sure that we preserve the institutional memory of local congregational churches going back into the pre-revolutionary era.
We're doing this conversation during the last week of Black History Month, and I was wondering if you could, you and Richard could share a little bit more about the new directions you're taking with Hidden Histories in order to highlight the importance of Blacks in the history of congregationalism in New England.
Yes, absolutely. Richard, would you please offer us a few words on BIPAC? You were absolutely instrumental in helping us put it together. So I'm wondering if you would please describe it for our viewers and tell us something of its value for scholars.
Yeah, so this is a new finding aid, a new part of the Congregational Library website that is meant to direct teachers, researchers, students to materials in the New England Hidden Histories Project related to the history of Black and Indigenous and other people of color in early Congregationalism. And I think for a long time, there were some assumptions that these sorts of records didn't tell us much about the history of African Americans and Native Americans. And I think that now we're at the point of saying there's actually quite a robust amount of material related to Wampanoag, Natick, other indigenous people, and certainly to enslaved and free African Americans in the colonial North. And so having a separate page on the website allows us to highlight those collections that are most relevant to these topics, provides a different path towards researching. Jeff's mentioned that the website for New England Hidden Histories is very user-friendly, and I agree, it's very easy to navigate. Looking sort of church by church and association or person by person, it's very clear organization. But if your research questions are related to the history of slavery or the history of abolitionism or the history of indigenous people's engagement with Christianity, this new finding aid provides a different website path. And everything's linked. So if you are reading through the finding aid, there's introductions that sort of explains the material, the types of material available, what you can find in them, and then links where you can click and go directly to the collections and view the material. One of the really exciting finds, and I think Jeff, it was you who found it, were some letters written by Lemuel Haynes. We've known about Lemuel Haynes for a long time. We've known some of his writing. He was the first African-American ordained as a congregational minister and led churches in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York. He led these predominantly white congregations for decades. And there was a biography published of him in 1837, 1838, written by a fellow minister. But we had a few pieces of writing by him and some sermons. One of his sermons against universalism went through a lot of editions in the 19th century. But in searching for church records, Jeff found some of the original letters by Lemuel Haynes. And so these are letters that are in 3 different church collections, and we're in the process of getting transcriptions put up for those. So now we can read and see Lemuel Haynes' letters to fellow ministers, in some cases to family members. Some of the relations that Doug has mentioned were for African Americans or Native Americans, and so you can find those quicker by going through this new finding aid. And the Abyssinial church records are there, the Native church records are there, and this is going to be continuing to evolve and change over time, and we'll get more collections. There's an anti-slavery society collection and a lot of anti-slavery material. We know that for African Americans who argued for their own liberation in the 18th century, we know that their congregational Christianity was really important for their arguments for freedom. And we also know that churches and ministers played a big role in arguing for the end of slavery in New England in the Revolutionary era, the early Republic, and then in opposing slavery's extension into the West in the antebellum period as well. So really rich material in these collections related to abolitionism and anti-slavery.
Thank you. I want to close our proceedings here by asking one more question of Doug in particular. Doug, as you know from your service on the advisory committee, we are constantly forced to prioritize. There is so much material out there, and we simply cannot digitize everything. We cannot transcribe everything. How would you justify the focus on New England for New England's hidden histories? I mean, there are congregational church records in Ohio as well. Why New England?
Well, I guess one thing I probably would want to steer clear of trying to suggest is that there's something distinctly American about New England. I think that we're long past thinking about sort of New England exceptionalism, but I think it's hard to argue that there is a better documented region of early American history than the New England Puritan colonies. And to that extent, once again, to think about it as a laboratory, as a place to test ideas, like the kinds of ideas that Richard's working on with the BIPAC project. It's an ideal place to do all sorts of work, and still is. I spend a lot of time these days in my current research working on those regions of places like Kentucky and Ohio, working with Presbyterian churches now. And there's nowhere near the volume of church records. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, there's no set of Presbyterian church records west of the Appalachians anywhere before 1820. So if anyone wants to know what the religious lives of ordinary people are like in the Trans-Appalachian West, it's really difficult to do. But if you want to know anything about ordinary people in 18th century British North America, how they understood disease, or how they understood childbirth, or what their politics were, or what how they understood the changes over the life course, or any of the things that I wrote about in my book, New England is the ideal place to look for those kinds of issues. And so while the field of early American history has become, as one of my colleagues says, sort of vast early America, hemispheric and even global in its dimensions, New England still remains a go-to place for understanding any specific issue that's central to the questions of what was life like in you know, the early.
One quick follow-up. I never tire of suggesting that we can learn more about life in colonial New England from its church records than from any other discrete body of sources. But do you think that that is equally the case as we move to 1800, 1820, 1840, 1870?
Really, the colonial era church records are kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's so much stuff out there. Those Abyssinian records, or the anti-slavery records that are in Sturbridge, that are kind of sitting, when I saw them last, they were sitting on the floor of the vault, of like this metal vault in the basement, just sort of lying in a heap. Important 19th century abolitionist records. In fact, the congregational church records only get exponentially larger when we get into the 19th century. All the same kinds of texts that survive from the 17th and 18th centuries you can find for the 19th century as well, even if the congregational churches were in more of a marketplace situation where they were being forced to compete with Methodists and Baptists and various kinds of sectarian groups like the Shakers. Those records are still as equally valuable for studying community dynamics or race beliefs in the 19th century as they are in the 18th. So maybe one day there'll be, you know, a 2.0 or a 3.0 version of New England's Hidden Histories where we can consider expanding the project. And that would be a totally worthy goal as well.
Yeah.
I want to just throw out a reference there to all the amazing scholarship of Peggy Bendroth that's done on congregationalism post-revolution, right? And really, I think to Doug's point, that all the things that she was able to write about in congregational history is still the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more, and someday for those 19th and 20th century records to be more accessible.
It sounds like we've got a lot of work to do.
Okay, Jeff, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I wish we could carry it on more, but I would also like to suggest that if Jeff doesn't mind having his, giving people his email address, people who have more questions about hidden history that they would like to see discussed in a future history talk might email Jeff, and we'll try and organize something of that. Would that be okay, Jeff?
Sure. My email is jcooper@14beacon.org. Beacon with a B.
Okay. Well, thank you all again. Thank you all again, and hopefully we might all find ourselves back doing the same thing in the future.